The Age of Jackson saw the formation of the second two-party system in America. If you remember, in the 1790s, the first two-party system consisted of the Federalists and the Republicans. We noted that the Federalist Party died out in the early 1800s. The Republican Party split into two different factions or wings within the Republican Party. There was the nationalist wing of the Republican Party and the Democratic wing of the Republican Party. This was the state for a time. But by the 1830s, in the Age of Jackson, these factions so went their separate ways that they ended up forming two separate parties, the Whigs and the Democrats. Now, as you noticed in lecture about the Age of Jackson already, a major issue dividing politics of the day was the controversial Bank of the United States. This was the single biggest issue that led to the formation of these two new parties, the National Bank. On the one hand, Whigs like Henry Clay tended to be firm supporters of the National Bank, and Democrats like Andrew Jackson opposed it. They didn't trust it. They feared that it was a corrupt institution that was taking advantage of many Americans. There were, of course, other political issues dividing the parties, other economic issues such as currency, debt relief, using tax money to fund internal improvements. This same time period we've been referring to as the Age of Jackson can also be seen as an age of reform because of the many different reform movements that were growing at the time. Look at literature, for example, to get an idea of this spirit of reform. With the literary style of the day, Romanticism, authors such as Emerson and Thoreau emphasized nature and emotion, and generally had a very positive view of human nature. Now, there certainly were critics like Nathaniel Hawthorne, for example, one of my personal favorites. Hawthorne, of course, had a negative view of human nature, always emphasizing the dark side, but he wrote a particular novel called The Blithedale Romance about a utopian community. And this was very much a product of his times because there were several such utopian community experiments going on during the Age of Jackson. Members of these utopian communities withdrew from the mainstream and joined these communities with radical ideas about how society should function. In the Blithedale Romance, the narrator, who definitely reminds you of Hawthorne himself, who actually lived in a utopian community for a while, and I'm sure wrote about personal experiences. He described some of the members of the community and their high ideals about equality and making the world better. There was one particular reformer who lived there whose goal in life was to reform all the criminals. By the end of the book, and I'll not give the novel away completely, but the experiment falls apart. For all their high ideals, the utopian community members turn on each other, and at the end of the book, the criminal reformer admits that he spent his whole life trying in vain to reform a single criminal himself. Anyway, this gives you an idea of what Hawthorne thought about the idealistic utopian communities of his day. But there were many such utopian communities. There were some that in ways resembled experiments of the 1960s with free love and so on. There were also the Shakers. They also qualify as a utopian community of this day. Like others, they withdrew from the mainstream with their own radical ideas about how to reform society. The Mormons would be another example. But moving on from literature and utopian communities, let's look at several examples of specific reform movements that were growing in popularity at this time. First of all, the temperance movement. Of course, members of the temperance movement believed that the root of many problems in society was the consumption of alcohol, and they wanted to use moral persuasion to convince people to limit their intake. And they thought that if their campaign was successful, this would help with problems like crime, poverty, domestic violence, and so on. There were several different benevolence movements. For example, founding hospitals for the poor, schools for the blind, and various ways in which to help people with disabilities. There was also an emphasis on reform in the area of education, particularly with reformers like Horace Mann, pushing for wider opportunities for public education. There was also the matter of criminal rehabilitation. Before this time, in America, like in Europe, crime was commonly punished with capital punishment, corporal punishment, or fines. Sometimes criminals in Europe were banished to America. Interestingly, people are breaking the law to get into America today. That used to be their punishment. But anyway, during the Age of Jackson, this age of reform, some reformers focused on changing the way they dealt with the problem of crime. Instead of simply punishing criminals, they thought that criminals should be viewed as victims themselves, as people who had a sickness who needed to be rehabilitated. This is where we began to see more of an emphasis on the prison system. There had been jails before, a few of them, and very overcrowded, but imprisonment hadn't been the primary way in which to deal with criminals. But during this time, there was a trend towards more and more emphasis on imprisonment and rehabilitation, trying to reform criminals and release them back into society as productive members. This is an important turning point if you compare where we are today to where we were, say, in the 1700s. You can't understand the difference unless you look at what was happening during this time of reform. We've sort of swung to the opposite extreme today. Prison populations have skyrocketed. In some states, there's approximately 1% of the population behind bars at any given time. When you look at the cost of keeping those prisoners in prison, of course, numbers vary, but you're looking at least $20,000 a year per inmate. That's quite expensive. I've heard that the vast majority of prison inmates are there on drug-related offenses. If someone could come up with an effective way to solve the drug problem, it would certainly be much more manageable to afford the prison system and focus on, rehabilitating criminals who can be rehabilitated and maybe dealing with others in other ways. And maybe there should be more experimentation with having inmates earn their keep while in prison. So if you think about it, during this age of reform, there was a lot of emphasis on rethinking the way we had been dealing with crime and focusing on the potential to rehabilitate criminals. But the solution that resulted in this was more and more prisons, and I think we should probably be looking at reforming yet more to maybe have a more effective balance between rehabilitation and punishing crime. And very many inmates are repeat offenders, and they end up right back where they started. And then there was the women's rights movement. An important development in the women's rights movement was the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where feminists wrote their own version of the Declaration of Independence, saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. Like Jefferson had accused King George III of a series of abuses, they accused men of being tyrants. They cited the inability to vote, property rights transferred to husbands in marriage, divorce and custody laws, limited employment and educational opportunities, and religious subordination. It would be a long time before American women gained the right to vote in the 1920s, but change began sooner in other areas, and in the present day the contrast is striking. But it's important to note that American women face some significant problems in the modern world. In fact, recent surveys suggest that instead of liberation, an increasing number of women say they are unhappy and that expanded opportunities have resulted in greater strain rather than fulfillment as they try to perform double duty with their families and careers. Some resolve that conflict by choosing not to have families, but many would prefer to have it the other way around. Surveys show that although a majority of moms work outside the home, only about 10% say they want to work full-time, with the rest dreaming of either working part-time or being full-time moms, but often unable to do so because of their financial situation. That's not quite liberation. When it comes to divorce reform, we now have access to no-fault divorce, but the result is an increased rate of broken homes, poverty, and dissatisfaction. The book, The Case for Marriage: Why Married People Are Happier, Healthier, and Better Off Financially, makes the case that some of the goals of the women's rights movement, such as divorce reform, have actually been counterproductive to their interests. And last but certainly not least, we have the anti-slavery movement, perhaps the single greatest reform movement of this time period. I think you know what anti-slavery means. Opponents of slavery who would love to see slavery disappear from America. But it was a little more complicated than that. Not all anti-slavery reformers were in agreement. For example, there was the American Colonization Society. As the name implies, colonization. They believed that once slaves were freed, they should be recolonized or sent back to Africa, instead of integrated into white American society. They also believed in a gradualist approach. They weren't trying to abolish slavery immediately, right away, all at once. They were satisfied with gradually getting rid of slavery, and even willing to consider compensating slave owners, buying slaves out of bondage. In one way, this was a pragmatic or practical approach, because since it was as conservative as it was more likely to be accepted by more people. But on the other hand, it wasn't very practical to talk about buying millions of slaves out of slavery with the consent of their masters. And according to many anti-slavery reformers, this simply was not going to succeed in the long run. There was some success. People like Henry Clay participated in this reform, and there were enough liberated slaves colonized in Africa. In Liberia, there was actually a place that came to be called Kentucky because of all of the former slaves who migrated there from Kentucky. But then there were the abolitionists, another wing of the anti-slavery movement. Abolitionists believed in an immediate end to slavery, not gradualism. They didn't think that masters should be compensated for their slaves, and they didn't believe that slaves should have to be sent back to Africa in order to enjoy their freedom. A couple famous abolitionists were William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. Garrison was a white abolitionist. He was a newspaper editor. In The Liberator, he was an outspoken supporter of the anti-slavery movement. Garrison believed in working outside the system. When people were constantly talking about working within the boundaries of the Constitution, Garrison dismissed the Constitution as basically a contract with the devil, because all along the American Constitution had accommodated slavery. So to some anti-slavery reformers, abolitionists like Garrison were simply too radical. Frederick Douglass was once a slave who escaped to freedom and became a famous orator traveling around the United States and Europe giving speeches about the evils of slavery. Like all of these reform movements I've mentioned, the anti-slavery movement was certainly a minority group. Okay, very few Americans were actively involved in fighting for an end to slavery, but they were still influential. They were a minority, but they were a persistent minority who kept getting their message out there until change did come. But as this anti-slavery movement grew and attracted more and more attention, it resulted in a defensive reaction from the South. The more that abolitionists challenged slavery, the more defensive Southerners became in defending it. Unlike Thomas Jefferson, who in an earlier period had seen slavery as a necessary evil, something he felt like he had to make excuses for, more Southerners came to defend slavery as a positive good. They insisted that slavery wasn't just something that they were stuck with, but that it was good for everyone involved, not just the masters, but they insisted that even the slaves were better off in bondage than they would have been in Africa. We'll consider the anti-slavery movement more later on.